Imagine it's 1780 in Paris. Late one night, a basement wall collapses in a busy neighborhood, and out pours a wave of rotting corpses. This isn't a horror movie. It really happened, and it forced Paris to confront a nightmare lurking under its feet. Welcome to the fascinating and sometimes gruesome history of cemeteries, where we'll uncover how the places we bury our dead have evolved from prehistoric caves to peaceful parks. Why does it matter? Because how we deal with death defines how we value life. By the end of this journey, you might never look at a graveyard the same way again. Right after that grisly hook, let's be clear. This video isn't just about spooks and ghouls. It's about history and how it can change your perspective. Understanding the origins of cemeteries can actually make you less afraid of them. It shows how every generation has faced the fear of death and found creative, if sometimes shocking, ways to cope. So strap in for a dark and dramatic tour through time, from ancient burial grounds to modern memorial gardens, with plenty of jaw-dropping stops along the way. You won't believe some of the things people did to make sure the dead stayed underground. Ready? Let's dig up the past, literally. Humans have been burying their dead for tens of thousands of years. In fact, archaeologists discovered a cave in Morocco filled with human skeletons from about 15,000 years ago, possibly the world's oldest cemetery. Even our Stone Age ancestors cared for their dead. They often buried bodies with tools, food, or flowers, hinting that they believed in an afterlife. Death wasn't just an ending, it was a mysterious next step, and they wanted their loved ones prepared for the journey. The word cemetery itself comes from the ancient Greek koimeterion, meaning sleeping place. To the Greeks, and later the early Christians, a graveyard was like a dormitory for souls. The dead were simply resting, awaiting a future awakening. This comforting idea caught on. By around the 5th century BC, the Greeks began setting aside special burial grounds outside their city walls. Why outside the city? Perhaps to keep any ghostly vibes and bad smells at a safe distance. The Romans continued this practice. If you took a walk on a Roman road, you'd pass tombs lining the roadside just beyond the city gates. Imagine monuments and mausoleums stretching for miles, a daily reminder of mortality for travelers leaving town. As Christianity spread in Europe, burial customs shifted from pagan grave fields to churchyards. By the early Middle Ages, being buried in consecrated ground, usually right next to a church, was the goal. Every village had its little graveyard beside the church, and major churches in cities had several. It seemed neat and orderly, at least at first. But as centuries passed and people kept dying, as people tend to do, those cozy little churchyards started overflowing. Graves were reused again and again. The typical medieval city graveyard might only hold a few thousand graves at a time. But beneath its soil lay layer upon layer of earlier burials, the remains of tens of thousands of people. And that's where the trouble began. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and the idyllic idea of a sleeping place had taken a dark turn. Churchyards had become jam-packed with bodies. How packed? In some places, the ground level rose several feet above the surrounding land, simply from centuries of stacked corpses. One famous Parisian cemetery, the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents, had been used for so long that its soil was 2 meters, 6+ feet, higher than the street outside, entirely composed of human remains. Every inch of earth was saturated with death. When a new body needed burying, there was no space, so gravediggers did what they had to. They opened up old graves, shoveled out the bones of long-dead skeletons, and stashed those bones in ossuaries, charnel houses, to make room for the freshly dead. Medieval cemeteries often had creepy galleries or vaults filled floor to ceiling with skulls and femurs. If you've ever seen the eerie decorative bone piles in places like the Sedlec ossuary or the Paris Catacombs, you get the idea. Back then it wasn't decoration, it was just storage. Cities had literal boneyards to hold yesterday's dead so today's dead could have a spot in the ground. And the smell, oh the smell. Imagine walking past a churchyard on a warm day and gagging from the stench of decay. Writers of the time complained that in some churchyards, the noxious air turned the stomach. At Holy Innocents in Paris, things got so bad that people said the cemetery smell could rot meat and warp the color of fabric hung out to dry nearby. Whether or not that was an exaggeration, there's no doubt these graveyards were a public health nightmare, but people kept using them. What choice was there? Earth was consecrated only once, and the dead were supposed to rest there forever, even if forever ended up being a few years until their grave was reused. It was a ticking time bomb of disease and disgust. Now toss in a catastrophe like the Black Death. In 1348, plague swept across Europe, killing half or more of the population in some cities. The usual burial system completely broke down. In many places, there was no time or space for proper burials. Corpses were piled into pits as fast as they could dig them. Chroniclers tell of mass graves where bodies were layered in like lasagna. A layer of bodies, a sprinkle of dirt, then another layer of bodies. Priests stood at the edge, hurriedly saying last rites over dozens of dead souls at once, because what else could they do? They even threw quicklime on the bodies, a caustic powder, hoping it would speed up decomposition and cut the smell. It didn't really. It just added chemical burns to the horrors. Throughout the late Middle Ages and into the 17th century, during repeated plague outbreaks, these scenes replayed. London's 1665 plague pits, for example, were filled with hundreds of bodies each. People lived in fear, not just of dying, but of not being buried properly. A terrifying thought in an age when the grave was seen as a sacred resting place. Medieval cemeteries had become, frankly, hell on earth. By the 1700s, something had to change. The living and the dead were quite literally on top of each other, especially in growing cities. The stage was set for a dramatic overhaul, and as we saw in the beginning, Paris would be ground zero for that revolution. Paris in the 18th century was one of the largest cities in the world, and its central graveyards were bursting at the seams. The worst offender was the Saint-Innocent Cemetery, right in the heart of the city. For hundreds of years, thousands of Parisians had been buried there, many in mass graves holding 1,500 bodies at a time. By 1750, locals were complaining of foul odors and even health issues caused by the cemetery. It got so bad that in 1780, it literally blew open. A wall bordering the cemetery caved in under the pressure of all the human remains behind it, and a disgusting slurry of half-decomposed corpses oozed into the basement of a nearby building. This was the body wave disaster we opened with. Imagine being the poor homeowner who found their cellar filled with liquefied human remains. Absolutely horrifying. That gruesome incident finally spurred authorities to action. The solution they devised was radical and logistically mind-boggling. Move the entire cemetery underground. By the late 1780s, under cover of darkness, Parisian workers began emptying the cemeteries. Every night, wagon loads of bones trundled through the streets, accompanied by priests chanting prayers for the dead. They weren't taking the remains far, just to the edge of town, where miles of abandoned limestone mines lay under the city. They spent years packing those tunnels with the bones of over 6 million exhumed bodies. Skull by skull, femur by femur, the workers carefully stacked them into the catacombs, arranging skulls and bones into patterns on the walls. What had been a public health emergency was transformed, with a mix of reverence and morbidity, into the world's largest ossuary. By 1809, the Paris Catacombs opened as a macabre tourist attraction, an underground city of the dead that visitors could safely walk through without gagging. Problem solved, at least in Paris. Other cities got the message. The Industrial Revolution was booming, populations were doubling, and the old churchyard model simply couldn't cope. So in the 1800s, there was a cemetery revolution. Cities began founding brand new cemeteries on their outskirts. Big, beautifully landscaped burial parks designed to be permanent and hygienic. In Paris, the model was Père Lachaise Cemetery, Opened in 1804 on a hilltop outside the dense city center. It was like nothing people had seen. Wide avenues, trees and flowers, elegant tombs spaced out in a park-like setting, no overflowing pits, no stench, just a garden of graves. It became the place to be buried. Ironically, you had to be rich or famous in the early days to get in. The idea spread fast. By 1832, London, which had suffered its own nightmare of packed churchyards and even a cholera epidemic made worse by contaminated groundwater, passed a law to close all its in-town graveyards. In their place, the city created the magnificent 7 cemeteries in a ring around London. These were enormous, lovely cemeteries like Highgate, Kensal Green, and Brompton Cemetery, designed with winding paths and gardens. At Highgate, for example, ornate Gothic tombs and obelisks line overgrown paths on a peaceful wooded hill. It's spooky and beautiful, exactly the romantic vibe the Victorians adored. The important thing was that these new cemeteries were sanitary and spacious. No more body fluids leaching into the city's drinking wells. Over in the United States, the trend caught on a little earlier, possibly because Americans had more land to work with. In 1831, Mount Auburn Cemetery opened near Boston as the first rural cemetery in the US. It was basically a public park and a cemetery in one. In fact, city folk back then would take carriage rides out to Mount Auburn or similar cemeteries on weekends to picnic among the tombstones. Yes, picnics in the cemetery were absolutely a thing in the 19th century. Families would stroll the manicured grounds, enjoy the scenery, and pay respects to grandma at the same time. It sounds morbid today, but to them it was perfectly normal. These new cemeteries were designed to be pleasant places for the living as well as the dead. They were some of the only green spaces around before public parks existed. Cemeteries, in short, had gone from ghastly charnel houses to almost fashionable places to visit. Art and architecture blossomed in these cities of the dead. Grand statues, weeping angel sculptures, impressive mausoleums, a far cry from the mass graves and skull pits of old. It was a massive culture shift in how society dealt with death. But even as we solved one set of problems, new dark tales emerged from these graveyards. As soon as we started planting our dead in nice, neat cemeteries, another grisly business reared its head: body snatching. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medical schools were desperate for cadavers to study anatomy. The supply was extremely limited. Only executed criminals' bodies were allowed for science by law, and those were few, so enterprising criminals took matters into their own hands. These grave robbers, known politely as resurrectionists, would sneak into cemeteries at night, dig up fresh corpses, and sell them to surgeons and anatomy professors. It was a lucrative, if disgusting, trade. In Britain, a single stolen corpse could fetch a small fortune from doctors in need. As you can imagine, ordinary people were horrified by this. It wasn't enough that your loved one died. You had to worry someone might steal grandma's body and chop it up in a medical lecture. The fear of grave robbers led to some creative countermeasures. Families who could afford it began reinforcing their loved ones' graves with heavy iron cages and grills called mort safes, basically jail cells for coffins. If you visit old cemeteries in Scotland today, you can still see iron cage graves and big stone slabs meant to thwart body snatchers. Some cemeteries even built watchtowers where guards, sometimes armed, kept an eye out for digging vandals at night. Poorer families who couldn't buy iron cages might place rocks and branches over a grave, or simply take turns standing guard until the body was sufficiently decayed. Body snatchers only wanted fresh corpses. It was an arms race between resurrection men and grieving relatives. In the 1820s, 2 men in Edinburgh, William Burke and William Hare, got so impatient waiting for people to die that they turned to murdering victims to sell their bodies. When the grisly Burke and Hare killings were revealed, public outrage finally pushed authorities to change the law. By the 1830s, medical schools could use unclaimed bodies, like those of poorhouse occupants, legally. which mostly put an end to the body-snatching era. But the damage to public imagination was done. Cemeteries had a new layer of horror lore. Speaking of horror, the 19th century also saw a spike in fear of something even more disturbing than grave robbers: the fear of being buried alive. Victorians were obsessed with this possibility, and not entirely without reason. There are recorded cases of people accidentally pronounced dead and later found alive in their coffins. The condition of comas and catatonic states wasn't well understood, so everyone had heard a chilling story of someone who woke up in their grave. This fear was called taphophobia, and it led to the invention of the so-called safety coffin. Ingenious and often patented designs for coffins included escape hatches, breathing tubes, and most popularly, a signal bell. A pipe ran from the coffin up to the surface with a little bell on top. If you woke up underground, you could pull a string or rod and ring the bell, alerting a watchman to dig you out. Some even had feeding tubes or flags that would pop up. It sounds crazy, but people really invested in these contraptions. Wealthy folks sometimes installed coffins with special locks that could be opened from the inside just in case. An unfortunate few were even buried with a telephone in the coffin. This was later once telephones existed. The phrase, "saved by the bell," takes on a whole new meaning, doesn't it? And let's not forget the vampire panic. Yep, real history had a vampire craze. In certain parts of Europe, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, communities grew fearful that some of their dead weren't staying dead. Folklore about vampires, restless corpses that preyed on the living, led to some creative burial tactics. Archaeologists have uncovered vampire burials, where a stone or brick was shoved in the corpse's mouth, or a sickle was laid across the throat, so that if the body reanimated, it would be incapacitated. In one famous case from Venice, a woman was buried with a brick jammed between her jaws, presumably to stop her from chewing her way out of the grave. Another burial in Poland had a blade positioned to decapitate the body if it tried to sit up. These weren't the norm, but they show how deeply the fear of the undead ran in some communities. Essentially, people went to extreme lengths to ensure that dead meant dead. What a ride, right? From prehistoric caves to vampire panics, cemeteries have a far more dramatic history than most of us ever imagined. But through all the dark and bizarre turns, one thing shines through: our human obsession with respecting and containing the dead. Every era found solutions, some smart, some desperate, to make peace with death. We went from tossing bodies in caves to churchyard burials at the heart of our communities to banishing graves outside city limits for cleanliness, to finally creating beautiful sanctuaries of remembrance. Today, when you walk through a quiet, well-kept cemetery, you're seeing the result of all that history and learning. The manicured lawns and orderly headstones are a world away from the skeleton piles of medieval Paris or the booby-trapped graves of 1800 Scotland. Modern cemeteries are designed to be places of peace, where both the living and the dead have their space. In fact, some cemeteries are doubling as parks and nature preserves, continuing that 19th century idea that these are spaces for the living to enjoy memory, art, and greenery. So next time you pass by a cemetery, remember the stories buried below. The epidemics and panics that changed how we bury our dead, the innovations that saved us from our own macabre problems, and the cultural shifts that turned scary graveyards into beautiful memorial gardens. In understanding this journey, perhaps we lose some fear of our own inevitable end. After all, every grave is a reminder that life goes on around it. If you found this journey as mind-blowing as I did, and you're not too creeped out, hit that like button. Let me know in the comments which cemetery fact shocked you the most. Was it the Paris Bone Mountain, the body snatcher cages, or those eerie safety coffins? Don't forget to subscribe for more surprising and epic history stories. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember, life is short, history is huge, so make every day count. See you in the next video.